it's my great pleasure today to be speaking with Walter Edgar, who has an association with SCE TV, as I am also fortunate to. Walter, everyone knows a lot about you, and certainly your beautiful voice is familiar to us, but I don't know how many people know how you came to be such a passionate gardener and how you transferred your great love and affection from your home of Mobile to South Carolina. So please tell us a little bit about your history.
All right. Well, I grew up in Mobile, Alabama. My great aunt and uncle created Bellingrath Gardens, which is now open to the public and managed by a trust and foundation. And as a young boy, I spent a lot of time down there. But the real gardener was my great aunt Bessie. It's named Bellingrath, that's her married name, but she was the gardener. It was her inspiration. And my grandmother was her sister, and she and my grandfather Edgar lived with us, and they were both tremendous gardeners. My grandfather was a retired businessman, and so he literally worked in the yard every day. Once a week he had a helper who would come mow the lawn, but everything else he did.
So he was a hands-on gardener. He didn't point and say, do this, do that.
He was a hands-on gardener. Everything planted by, with seed. He disdained anybody he bought a potted plant from a nursery. And he taught me at an early age, he lived there in the house, and I sort of tagged along with him, and he all the borders were his, and he would help me weed. And he taught me a lesson, because one spring I pulled up little marigold sprouts because they look like weeds to me. But the difference in the fact that every time he walked out, he said, if you see a weed, take it up. Don't say, I'm going to weed on Saturday. If you see a weed, go ahead and pull it up. So it was a never-ending process. And we had a much warmer climate than we do here, so there was always something blooming in the yard to be cut and brought into the house.
How wonderful. And Walter, you came to South Carolina, I believe, as a student. Is that correct?
Yes. I did my undergraduate work at Davidson College, and then I came to South Carolina to get my PhD, which I did in 1969. And then I went in the Army for 2 years. Spent a year in Vietnam on an advisory team. And while I was in Vietnam, I applied for a postdoctoral fellowship with the National Archives. And I thought, I've seen Southeast Asia. I've spent all my world in the South. Why don't I apply to work for the Daniel Webster papers in New Hampshire? Well, the National Archives had other ideas. They sent me to South Carolina to work with the Henry Lawrence papers with George Rogers. And it was like Burr Rabbit in the Briar Patch. I had never intended, when you go to graduate school, you go off somewhere to work. And when that year was up with the National Archives and the Lawrence papers, I ended up with a job at the University of South Carolina in the history department, where I taught for 40 years.
And Walter, you fell in love with your first wife, who sadly is no longer with us, who was Erast, a famous South Carolina name in agriculture, and y'all gardened, you gardened on Hollywood, in Columbia for decades, didn't you?
Yeah, 42 years. Lived in the only house we had ever bought, and when we bought in that Hollywood section, it was what the real estate people called a transitional neighborhood. That was before chic. Well, that's all a young assistant professor and his school teacher wife could afford. But it was a wonderful place for a yard, because we bought the newest house in the neighborhood.
Oh.
But it had been built in 1954. But that meant for the 40 years before that, while that whole section had been developed, everybody had dumped their leaves on that lot. It was basically had been the giant mulch pile for the neighborhood. So instead of red clay, we started off with a yard that was pretty nice to begin with in terms of
rich in organic matter. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then Walter, your new wife was my mother's best friend's daughter, Neela, And y'all have made a decision to move to Stillhope. So tell us, that's a real downsize in property. And how long have you been there?
All right. Well, two things. One thing quickly is when Neil and I got married 14 years ago, what house do you live in? And she said it wasn't a question of the house. She said she knew that my garden and my yard had developed meant so much to me that we remodeled the house on Hollywood Drive. We made a decision to move out here. It was one of those things that happened. Everything's serendipitous. A couple of years ago, we'd had some friends who had to have rehabilitation. You know, when you get to be our age, somebody has a fall. And Neela said, wouldn't it be nice if we had to rehab, we could do it at Stillhopes and not at some other places? So you had to get on a list out here at Stillhopes, which we did, paid our deposit. So if we unfortunately broke an arm or leg and had to be rehabbed, we could be out here. And then we got a call and said, would you like to come out and think about maybe at some time living out here? And we said, fine, but we don't want to live in an apartment. We want to live in a cottage. And this was the fall of 2018.
2018.
And they said it'll be 5 or 7 years before we can have a cottage available. They were all occupied. Well, 5 months later, we got a call and said there's a cottage available. Would you like to come out and look at it? And you have 48 hours to make a decision whether you want the cottage or not. Well, Neela and I had just packed. We were getting ready to go to Mobile for Mardi Gras annually. And so we came out here to the cottage, looked at it late in the evening, and it was one of those things, Amanda, we walked in the door and it was just like this house was talking to us. Oh. And so next morning, before we left to Mobile, I signed all the papers. And we moved in June 2019.
And Walter, you said that you decided that you, with the help of the very fine garden designer and head of the crew there, that you wanted to make a clean start of the yard. Is that correct?
That's correct. We didn't do it right away. You move in June. That's not exactly the best time to. But yes, Chris Spearin, who is the head of the landscape crew here, and by the way, for many years he was at the Botanical Gardens. He's just an incredible young man. I said, this shrubbery looks. I know it's easy to maintain, but it reminds me of a parking lot. We'd like to have some more southern plants and some native plants and certainly some, as I say, real azaleas. I don't like those ever-blooming things. I like. And he said, okay, we can work that out. And so over the last 14 months, we have redone the complete landscape around our house. And one of the things that we created front and back are cutting gardens.
Yes.
Sheila has her herb garden that she specifically wants, and everything was great this year until we just had a cold snap the last few days, and so the basil went.
Well, let's kind of start with where you have a place for 2 automobiles, which is very fortunate, and both you and Neela have family objects that were important and lent themselves to be displayed. I believe she, of course, her mother was a reamer originally, and so she has 2 very large and beautiful cast iron pots that you use to flank the parking areas. Is that correct?
That's correct. As you know, most of those decorative urns from the old days are very shallow and they get very hot, so we have succulents planted in those. And then there's a very large urn that my grandfather Edgar had worked with his family's firm, which was the Mobile Pulley and Iron Works. And in the Depression, there was not a lot of market for business machinery, so they did decorative ironwork. And this huge pot, have a nice Queen Kimberly fern in it, huge. Yes. And we have an iron table on the back porch. So we brought these family pieces with us because just is, it's just a bit of who we are.
And then Walter, also, Carolyn Gibbs Croswell, whose family also was in the iron business. I believe that her father, Mason, wanted you to have a memento from their business. Is that correct?
That's correct. Gibbs Machinery Company, which used to stand at the corner of Blossom and Assembly. All around the top of the facade, on four sides, they had these big cuts that said, it was the Gibbs Machinery Company logo, which was actually the imprint in the manhole covers that they made. And when the university bought that building to tear it down, Mason had all of the logos removed, and he said he would like for me to have one. And Caroline Gibbs, longtime friend, Croswell, called up and said, Daddy would like you to have one of these, and we've got it as wall art now. So
that's wonderful. Well, let's talk about, you have that lovely front covered porch area, and for privacy, you have put in, I believe, a hedge, what will be a hedge.
Yeah.
Is it laurel petalum that you chose, Walter?
It's laurel petalum that I chose. They're the miniature variety, so they won't get that tall. They'll get just about as tall as a safety railing that runs around the edge of that piece of property eventually.
Perfectly.
And on the side closest to the street, we have miniature oleanders.
And then, in order to always have things that Neela can bring in the house, you've got kind of a herbaceous and area there that's filled with pass-along plants. And you're a good historian. You had them all typed up for me, and I recognize the names of so many people. Margaret Rembert, whom of course we know, I believe, gave you some daisies.
She gave daisies. They used to be our neighbors on Hollywood Drive, and she passed those along. So we brought those from Hollywood Drive.
And then you've got things from Mary Belser. I believe you've got some sage or salvia from Mary, and rudbeckia perhaps.
We got rudbeckia from her, and the sage came from Mary Taylor.
Oh, Mary Beverly's mother. Yeah, Mary Taylor.
Yeah. So there's another agricultural connection, and so again, those plants came from Hollywood Drive. We brought them with us.
And then the roof iris. That is a fun story, I think you said, because it kind of traveled across the ocean.
Yes, the roof iris came from the late Henry Lumpkin, who was a professor of history at USC. But before that, he had been the historian of NATO, and he was based in Belgium for most of his adult life before he came back to Columbia. And he brought these iris with him. They grew in the thatched roofs of cottages in the Belgian countryside. And when my first wife Betty and I bought the house on Hollywood Drive, Henry came up with a gift of these roof iris. And those moved with us to Hollywood Drive. And when they bloomed the first year we had them out here, which was amazing. I took a picture and sent a photo to Harriet Whitehouse, Henry's daughter, who lives down in Jackson, Mississippi.
Oh.
And she was just absolutely delighted because she had, as she said, a patch that Daddy brought down here is.
From Belgium to Mississippi and South Carolina. Isn't that a lovely story? And from a great historian. I'm sure you have given him many accolades over the year. Very important. And Papyrus, Walter, which many of us have in our gardens, and we just got it. Unlike we went against your grandfather's advice and got it at a nursery, but yours has quite a story, I believe.
Yes, this again was a house gift when we got the house on Hollywood Drive. My Aunt Mary Dora, who passed away earlier this fall in her 90s, was a tremendous gardener, and she and my uncle came through town, and she said, "You've got to have some of this in your yard." She always called it Moses and the Bulrushes, which is probably an old Southern name. But it's been there since '72, and I dug some of it up and brought it out here.
And then paper whites, which are people don't often realize, or the very, very earliest of the bulbs might have been in bloom since November. And yours, I think that came from Betty Rast, your dear sweet first wife, and it traveled all around and to Texas, or what's the story?
The story on that is her great-grandfather was it was the scandal of the family. He was the only one that did not graduate from college because he was part of the Great Biscuit Rebellion at South Carolina College before the Civil War, where they rebelled against the food in the dining hall and they all got expelled. So he, like a lot of other people, when you have a problem, he went off to Texas. And when he left, his mother gave him a bag of paper white bulbs, which he took to Texas.
So he wasn't completely cast out of the family.
No, he wasn't completely cast out of the family. But he got to Texas. He stayed there, actually had a Texas family, went through the Civil War, was a veteran. His wife died out there, and he decided to come back to South Carolina, which he did, and he married a South Carolina girl. And when he came back, he brought the bulbs back, and they were planted at his wife's family's place over in Pelion, and therefore we got them passed down from Betty's grandmother. So they've been multi-generational, multi-moved, and multi-loved, and they are very sweet paper whites. I mean, they're the old-fashioned ones, and we love them.
Yes. And then when we were filming the B-roll at your property, I was searching to find 3 sticks because they marked a place where tiger lilies will come up. Eleanor Pope, who has, I must say, the most beautiful the small native deciduous magnolia that is so glorious in the fall, and is a marvelous gardener herself. Did she give those perhaps to Neela's mother, and now they are...
Well, what happened is Neela's mother gave those to Eleanor when she and Bill set up housekeeping.
I see.
When Neela and I got married and redid the house on Hollywood Drive, Eleanor brought some corms over and gave to us, and of course we moved those out here. And yes, they've been cut back, but they did bloom. Once we got them out here, they did bloom, so they liked the transfer.
And then one of the things, as you said earlier, I'm kind of the same mind. Azaleas should bloom in the spring, but you have azaleas that are reminiscent of home. You have the Formosa, but then of course, since you're from Mobile, what's the other one that you have to have as well?
The Pride of Mobile, which is, growing up, I knew what the official name was, but we had these 2 huge bushes in our house. 4. I'm talking about they were like 6 or 8, 10 feet apart, and that tall.
Very large, yeah.
And we called them early pinks and late pinks, or watermelon pinks. And the Pride of Mobile, where it's a watermelon pink color. It's just absolutely beautiful. And of course, in their season, the Formosas and the Pride of Mobile are great cut flowers.
Yes, they are. And so attractive to pollinators as well, and have a nice fragrance. People don't realize how many attractive attributes they have sometimes. And then, Walter, you also, although we've mentioned all these things, I think you and Chris together have done a wonderful job getting some continuity. For texture, you've got some Cephalotaxis and yew, I believe, and then some beautiful dwarf white Sasanquas. Is that correct?
Yes. Some he bought, some brought from Mobile. Bobby Green, who is kind of the keeper of heritage camellias, that's where you go to get them, has developed some dwarf Sasanquas. And that Mardi Gras we were in Mobile, I told him we were moving to a place we didn't have a whole lot. And he said, well, I'll give you some things that'll grow in a pot.
Yeah.
And some they were in a pot, but also they do very nicely as a low feature in the garden.
And as we walk around the house, you have a retaining wall, which is nice because it gives you kind of 2 levels to work on, Walter. And in the upper level, you have opportunities for seasonal color with some very large and attractive pots that you can change out, I believe.
Well, we do. We change them out. Right now they still haven't been killed, although I haven't checked after the last frost, which is pretty recent. We had crotons, which of course gives wonderful color for the fall. And we had hibiscus, and the cold did get the hibiscus.
And that's a good place for you to have Neela's herbs, because she enjoys having those fresh herbs. So I saw that there were a good many of those there. And because of the 2 levels, it really expands the amount of yard you have. You also have a camellia there that you said is Neela's favorite, and it was not one I was familiar with.
Well, Lady Claire is her favorite, and that's an old-fashioned one. It's a single. It's one of the early bloomers. But as you know, this year
everything's up for grabs. Yeah.
I mean, I've seen pink perfections in bloom, which you don't normally see this time of year. Certainly not here. But anyway, yes, Lady Claire is just a wonderful old-fashioned camellia and very prolific bloomer. We bought that because our Lady Claire was tall as the house on Hollywood Drive and could not move it. It had been a pass-along plant from Betty's grandmother from her yard.
Oh my goodness!
But the symbolism of that early bloomer. We've got some others. We've got a red velvet, which is a great dark Christmassy red, and one we got from Bobby Green, which is. Everybody knows the Professor Sargent, the very tight carnation looking.
Yes.
Well, Bobby said, the man got all the credit, but his wife is the real naturalist. And so he has developed a variation of the Professor Sargent. And I regret I can't recall exactly what the name was, because he said it's the Lady Professor Sargent. Well, but he gave it a full name. It's like the Mary Amanda Sargent.
But we can call Mrs. Professor Sargent if we want to.
Professor Sargent.
Walter, of course, you love fragrance, so you have tea olive, some of the smaller ones that won't overtake your yard. And then you've got gardenias. We have to have gardenias. I think you've got some smaller versions of those as well.
But we also have the traditional.
Okay. Well, and that would not be unsurprising. You are a traditionalist in many ways. And then you have talked about the fact that going from the heavenly soil of Hollywood Drive to Lexington, clay, and sand. So you've had to, you're having to do a good bit of amending and caring for plants, I believe.
Well, yes. Still Hopes the retirement community is built on property owned by the Ginyards. The Ginyard Bricks Works, for many years, Columbia's greatest industry, or one of the greatest industries. Well, I know why they were in the brick business, because it's sand and clay. So I discovered very early on that anything I planted, we had to bring in topsoil and a lot of mulch. And basically the 2 cut flower beds dug out and brought in just a lot.
Yes.
It was necessary.
And recently, Chris has helped you add some irrigation at a newer area that's somewhat shady. And you said finally you can have some hydrangeas.
Yes.
And I think you are developing an interest in native azaleas as well.
Yes, we brought in some native azaleas, which again I had grown on Hollywood. And they're beautiful to bring in the house. And of course they're untraditional color. You get yellows and bright oranges. I mean, I know you can get a pink one, but I had Chris get the yellow and the orange, and of course his association with Clemson, and you love that too. So,
I'm not one of those football fanatics, I must admit. My mother, of course, was a giant Carolina fan, and if you know how well behaved my sister is, and my mother was very much like that. But at Carolina football games, she would jump up on the bench and scream and holler, and we would act like we weren't with her because it was so completely out of character for her. Well, Walter, we are so happy in South Carolina and so blessed that you have made us your adopted state. And I know that my mother's friend Cornelia is smiling down on heaven that you and Neela have found each other as after losing your first wonderful spouses. And I hope that as you continue to develop your garden, you might let us come and see how much a southern garden can be replicated in a relatively small space if one takes the time and care to, every time you see a weed, bend over and pull it up.
Well, thank you.